Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Finley. He's a Senior Research Associate and Program Manager of Economic Analysis and Policy Assessment with the Institute for Transportation Research and Education here in Raleigh. He specializes in policy assessment, asset management, and inventory, economic impact analysis, multimodal transportation, and unique transportation engineering studies and logistics. Dr. Finley is leading a multidisciplinary team from North Carolina State to design and conduct a citizen survey on attitudes relative to taxes collected to support the North Carolina Department of Transportation. I know you have some of your colleagues here as well, so if you can introduce your colleagues and take us through the results of your study. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Mr. Chairman, before the presentation gets started, I'd like to say a couple things. One, the commission is very special, but on this case, on this research topic that you're about to hear, we started this research project about 18 months or so ago. Just that the coincidence that the initial findings are available and you're the first group that is going to listen to. But within the Department of Transportation, we have our own research unit, and they are available to us as staff to go out and do things. We traditionally do research on asphalt, on travel times, all that kind of stuff. But we took a different approach, and that was, let's do some research on behavior of people and what they think about what they are paying for. So we started out this project a little over 18 months ago, if I remember right. One of them was because we had never done it in North Carolina. We were always reliant on national studies. And so we wanted to bring the topic home. So what you're seeing today, something that we started a while back, but it fits so well with the mission and purpose of this commission. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Bert, for kicking that off, and thanks to Bert and AMNA and NCDOT for guidance and sponsoring this research study and this survey. As the chairman mentioned, we do have a number of team members here with us. Weston, Ravi, Michael, Nick, and Larry are all on the team, and I really enjoyed this team. It was a large team for a research project that we have, full of robust discussions. A lot of wordsmithing on these questions. We would spend sometimes an hour talking about a couple of words in one question on our survey, meeting on a weekly basis doing this. So it was a very, very enjoyable project to work on, and happy to be able to present those results to you here today. I do want to give a little bit of some background. A lot of our focus on the questions were really focused around road funding. So be clear, that's what we're talking about in a lot of these. And there are varying levels of detail and specificity in the questions. So some of our questions are more at a 30,000-foot view, and some of them are very specific. And so there was a balance in our survey in those questions and trying to balance the amount of time it would take the users to respond to those questions. And one of the key things that we have found, and that I'll bring up several times through the presentation, is the framing of the question matters. The hypothetical that you present, the options you give them, whether it's a free response, all matters into the question itself. So we've heard today, we've heard from the others in the previous sessions, there are challenges to the long-term sustainability of the revenue streams. And so this survey is going to look at some of those options that are available, some that other states have tried, some that North Carolina may try in the future, and the existing revenue streams, and see what people's thoughts are. And the research and previous literature shows that there are differences by demographic groups. So we're going to talk about some of those differences by groups as well. And a lot of states are exploring these funding mechanisms. One of the ones in particular we've heard a lot about is the mileage-based fees. And so a lot of states have tried pilot programs, and this survey may help give some insight into North Carolinians' opinions on mileage-based fees and some of the other options for transportation revenue. So this survey in particular was designed to better understand those perceptions. And one of the key findings, and think about this as I go through the presentation, really there is support for increasing road funding. There is a preference for the gas tax, but it does look like there's support to diversify those funding sources. So if I had to put it all in one sentence, what our general finding is, and so you look for that as we go through these questions, and look for that as an overall picture as we go through this. So as any good research is going to start, you're going to start with looking at the state of the practice and the literature. What have others done in this area, looking at measuring opinions and preferences from citizens. So we compiled all that literature And I think we did a good job of putting it into one table. So there's a lot of information here across the columns. We have our dependent variables. So this is we looked at studies that asked people whether they support new taxes or increased taxes, tolls, VMT fees, anything around financing roadways, increased revenue. In the rows, we have the independent variables. So these are some of the demographic factors such as age, education, employment, gender, and so forth. So we really wanted this to help inform what we're going to use in our survey. And some of the things that we find in this, looking at the individual cells, the green cells, these are cells that indicate the variable was positively correlated with the dependent variable, and the red cells show when there's a negative correlation. When there's a blank, when there's nothing in a cell, that means it wasn't included in that study, and the asterisk means it was included but wasn't statistically significant. So this is kind of the framework. So as an example, we can see the second row here for education. We have lots of those plus signs, lots of green cells. That means lots of studies looked at this, included education, and higher levels of education were correlated with support for these various measures, tolling, VMT, and other things. We can see similarly the last row here, the political party identification or affiliation, lots of green cells, lots of the plus sign, and this represents people who are affiliated with the Democratic Party tending to support those various mechanisms at a statistically significant level. Now, maybe on the other side, you may look at a couple that you think would maybe have an impact but didn't. Employment is one, so you can look across the row for employment. It's the third row here. We can see that several models included it, but it wasn't statistically significant. Similarly, for miles driven, wasn't as significant as we thought it may have been. So again, we used this to help inform what we were doing and what questions we asked on our survey. So our survey, the 2019 Public Perception Survey, this was a statewide survey. We had coverage across the state, both urban and rural communities, which is somewhat different than a lot of studies. A lot of these studies have focused either on metro areas or maybe didn't drill down enough into rural areas. We wanted our survey to make sure we had coverage across the state to generate a full statewide estimate. The overall sample was 2,245 responses. These are randomly selected based on their address, and we did use weights applied to these values. So all the estimates we see on the upcoming slides do have estimates or weights were applied to help represent the state population. Before we jump into the 2019 survey, let me just back up just a step into a question that was asked previously in 2018. So in 2018, there was an NCDOT customer service survey. It was largely about a lot of other things related to transportation, but there was one question related to financing. And we asked people how much they currently believe they were paying annually for transportation taxes and fees. And we heard from Bert recently that actual figure, the estimate that North Carolinian pays is $770 in transportation taxes and fees. But in our survey, represented by the orange bars here, the middle 50% range from $500 to $2,000, with the median of $1,000 and an average of $1,600. So actually around 75% of our respondents in that statewide survey thought they paid more than what they probably actually did. So that was the kind of one question that has been North Carolina specific in the past. So jumping back into our survey, the 2019 survey that was just completed, we're going to see this slide format come up over and over again. So I'm going to explain it a little bit here, and then we'll see the pattern on these upcoming slides. On the left side of the screen, we've got the summary information that's either going to be in a bar graph or a pie chart that kind of presents that whole statewide estimate. On the right side of the screen, we've got information about groups. So we want to look at a lot of that demographic information in these line graphs. And you'll notice there's some red font. Anywhere there's red font means there's a statistically significant difference between those two groups. But one thing to look for, sometimes those circles are still pretty close together, so there may be no practical difference. So just because it's a red font doesn't mean it actually is important. You have to look at both whether it's statistically significant and whether it has some practical significance as well. And so those groups that we're presenting here, urban and rural at the top, gender, age, education level, political party affiliation, number of miles driven daily, and the number of vehicles in the household. So that's kind of the format that you'll see on these upcoming result slides. So this question was specifically asking the participant to tell us what they think they currently pay, what the current tax rate is for the gas tax, including both state and federal. The correct answer is approximately 55 cents. Less than 30% of people got that correct. So we gave them ranges. Less than 30% got it correct. Most people actually thought it was lower than that, which is somewhat contradictory to our previous slide from the 2018 study. And that's likely a framing study when we asked a framing issue, when we asked them just generally over the whole year, how much do they pay versus getting very specific to that rate. But again, very few people knew that, less than 30%. And we gave people the option to select don't know. And actually about a fifth of people just said, I have no idea, so I just don't know, which was kind of surprising that many people didn't even feel comfortable enough to wager a guess on this question. And overall, there weren't, in my opinion, highly significant differences from a practical perspective between these groups, but there are some statistically significant differences in there. And one of the things that Dr. McHugh talked about earlier was the ease of collection, and perhaps this is the ease of the collection of the gas tax somewhat hides this from people. They don't see it. There's no, on the receipt, it doesn't give you that breakdown of how much went to the gas station versus how much went to state or federal taxes. And so that may be part of the reason why there isn't as much information or knowledge about what the actual gas tax rate was. We also asked a broad question about how people felt about the current level of spending on roads in the state. And the majority of individuals believe that road funding should be increased. So around 55%. And then around another 30% felt that the current level was adequate, no change, where only less than 10% thought that a decrease in funding would be appropriate. And this was over 50% for every category except those with a bachelor's degree and higher, and those who identified as Republican in the survey. So aside from those, every other group felt more than 50% supported a funding increase. We asked several questions, this is the first of which, get into trying to understand what people would support in terms of paying for roads, paying for transportation. And in this one, it's a very broad set of options. We only gave them two choices. We wanted them to tell us whether transportation should be funded from general sources, general taxes that could include sales tax, property tax, vehicle property tax, or things that should be specific to the usage of the system. And that could be gas tax, tolls, miles driven. We gave them some of those examples. And what we see from this pie chart is a roughly 50-50 split in terms of people thinking that it should come from general sources versus usage-based options. Some of the groups that preferred usage-based options were those who were older, urban, those who drove less than 30 miles a day, and males. And so we can see there are some slight differences for some of these groups and some statistically significant differences as well. Getting into a little bit more on the usage-based fees. So we presented them with three options, and we wanted them to rank those three options. We told them that you could either choose to pay by the amount of fuel used, pay by the amount of miles driven, or pay by the weight of your vehicle. And of course, these don't all have to be separate options in any kind of system. You could combine these, but this is the way we presented it to the participants. More respondents preferred the fuel used, and I think that's somewhat maybe towards the bias of what our current system might be. But there was still a lot of support for other options. There was no clear winner in this that the majority supported over any of the others. The younger respondents were the only ones who had a preference other than fuel used, and they chose vehicle weight instead of fuel used as the largest option.
Just tell me, what's the y-axis? Is that number of people?
Yes, this is the number of responses in these categories. Yeah, great question. We also wanted to get some perspective on fairness, or how they felt about the amount they're currently paying. So we provided them a hypothetical. So taking the other fees out of the $770, and just looking at gas tax, just state and local gas tax, we told them that a driver who drives approximately 15,000 miles may pay on the order of $400 annually. And we asked them whether or not they thought this was a fair amount. And the majority, although just a slight majority, felt that $400 was fair. Another approximately 10% felt that $400 was inexpensive. It was cheap to have that access to that many miles. And then a fair number, approximately 40%, thought it was expensive. And again, this is one that I think the framing was important. I think if you had put this $400 cost in terms of a daily cost, if you were to say slightly more than $1 a day to drive 15,000 miles in a year, that likely would generate different results as well. Similar to some of the other options, looking at some of these groups and the differences in groups, some of them are very close together, although some of the ones that were less likely to think it was fair were females, individuals with less than a bachelor's degree, and multi-vehicle households. We know that one of the most popular options that states are exploring are vehicle miles driven fees. And so we wanted to put this question directly to the participants. What do you prefer, gas tax or a miles driven fee? Get right to the point in this one. And we found about a 1/3, 2/3 split. About a third would prefer a miles driven fee. 2/3 would prefer to stay with the gas tax. Very little differences between the demographic groups, as you'll see from the line graphs. And this overall result, though, is pretty consistent with a lot of the national studies. So there was a summary of 33 studies, and overall they found a 24% support for mileage-based user fees. So 24% in this study compared to our survey that found 32%, roughly on that same order of magnitude. And that was whether or not the question was framed as a general support for, so just generally do you support a mileage-based fee, or as a replacement of the gas tax specifically. There was a study in Georgia that looked at, that provided a specific amount. So they said, would you support a 1.6 cent per mile fee? And that actually had higher support. So actually 39% support for that. So maybe giving that exact number, 2 cents per mile, maybe sounds better than some just hypothetical, oh, I'm going to pay per mile. And maybe they're thinking of, is that 50 cents a mile, $1 a mile? And the number, I think, is much lower when you actually run that calculation of what it would take, is much lower than I think people expect just hearing that number. So that's something that could be explored in a further survey is, where's their sensitivity around that kind of cost per mile instead of looking at just a general miles-based fee.
Just one question, Keith, on the last less than 30 miles driven daily versus more than 30 miles. Just tell me what you're taking away from that, what I should take away from that.
I would say overall, so the statistical significance is because we had a fairly large sample size in both those categories. But in terms of a practical perspective, you're looking at 26 or 27% versus 36 or 37%. So to me, that's somewhat still in the range of what some of the national studies have found. Although what it is saying here is that the drivers who drive more than 30 miles a day have a lower preference for miles driven. So the people who drive more would rather stick with the gas tax. And there's a lot of information around there, possible misinformation. Amna brought up a great point earlier about rural drivers typically driving less fuel efficient vehicles. So they may be, in a lot of cases, rural drivers are probably paying more in the gas tax than they would on a vehicle miles driven fee, but they don't see it that way. They're just kind of thinking about, oh, this is kind of a tax on us because we're driving more miles. So a lot of those need to be explored and figure out what that impact may actually be. But the studies that are out there so far are actually pointing to rural drivers paying less in a miles-based fee. So maybe even more importantly than what they selected in that previous one, the miles driven or the gas tax, is why they felt that way. And this is something that gets a lot of attention anytime a miles driven fee comes up. We did not prime any of our respondents with any choices here. This was a free response. We just simply asked them, why did you choose what you chose in the previous problem? And so we've summarized this. It took a lot of time and a lot of effort by very talented staff to come up with this and make sure that we've categorize everything correctly. On the left, we see reasons for selecting the miles driven fee, and on the right, we see the gas tax. The largest piece of the pie in each is fairness. So in the gray, we see fairness. So fairness came up regularly as why you would choose one or the other. Although, as I'll talk about some of the specifics with the gas tax, there are other reasons why people supported staying with the gas tax or using the gas tax. And some of the things that I think this could inform the way it's communicated to the public about rolling out any type of mileage-based fee would have an impact. So as an example, on people who said, I want to stick with I want to choose a mileage-driven fee, they thought this is just more fair because everyone would contribute. We saw a lot of people having concerns about electric and hybrid vehicles, and then out-of-state drivers who may not be paying in the gas tax system, but would be paying if there was a miles-driven fee. Looking at the gas tax, a lot of people still said it's fair because they felt that the gas tax represents mileage and driving on a road. And for a long time of our history, it did. We're starting to get where those edge cases are getting to be a little bit larger, and maybe we need to be a little bit more concerned as the fleet and technology change, though. So that was still the plurality of reasons for the gas tax was in the fairness category. Some of the other things, logistics, we've heard a lot about this. Looking at miles driven fee, how do you implement this? How do you roll this out? The gas tax is a pretty easy thing to collect, but a miles driven fee is going to get much more complex. So people were worried that you could cheat at cheat on your mileage. You can't cheat at the gas pump. If you're buying gas, the tax is built into it, but you may be able to cheat with a mileage driven fee, or they felt this. And they also felt that from a logistic standpoint, it's a separate bill, it's something else to do, something else to pay or to track. So just the logistics of this would be difficult. A lot of people like the gas tax from an environmental perspective. So 10% of people thought that this essentially works as a carbon tax, and that by taxing gas, you encourage fuel conservation and reduce the environmental impact. And then privacy is one of the biggest things that we see with miles driven fees. But without giving them that as an option, with just a free response, only 3% of people brought up privacy. And this is the same things we've heard a lot about privacy concerns. Is my actual location going to be tracked? And there's lots of ways that you could create a system that may not need to track individual vehicles, or provide an incentive for letting the exact location being tracked, which may be more favorable. So these are some of the reasons behind choosing the gas or the miles driven fee.
Could you just very briefly state how you could do that without the invasion of privacy?
Well, one option you could do is you could do it based on the odometer. You could still charge them as people fill up. You'd have to separate the vehicles, but people who are buying gas, you could still charge them at the gas pump. This has been one suggestion that's been done. And then on an annual basis, either have them pay a little bit more if they've driven kind of more miles than what you would expect for that vehicle. So they could, on an annual basis, when they register their vehicle or they pay for their vehicle inspection, you say, okay, you owe $27. We looked at your total amount paid. You paid $314, but you drove more miles than that. Or you drove fewer miles, so you actually we owe you $12. So you could keep it, I think, at a level that's very open and just looking at the miles driven, or you could get very specific where you're trying to incentivize, as we heard this morning, a lower rate for people driving to work. So maybe people in rural communities who have a long commute to work, maybe you say, look, if you put this transponder in your vehicle, we'll charge you maybe a lower half the rate or no charge for any trips that are going to and from work. So I think you can maybe even offer in that spectrum. And that's why a lot of states, or a number of states, have started pilot programs to test some of these things. What are people willing to do? What are some of the incentives that they'll work with? What are some of the things that they'll be interested in trying? Yeah, great question. It's very interesting to kind of talk about and think about how to make this work in a way that's efficient and not too administratively burdensome. We did ask a specific question about a topic that's been present in the legislature, and one that's been a focus is some drivers paying less because of fuel efficiency. So hybrid vehicles currently do that. So we ask people whether or not they support hybrid vehicle drivers paying less due to their higher fuel efficiency. And this support is fairly low. Only about a third of people say, yeah, I support hybrid drivers paying less. This is in opposition to another study that found 63% support in a national study, but the framing was very different. So we kind of led off saying hybrid drivers are going to pay less because of higher fuel efficiency. This national study focused on the environmental. So they kind of said, shouldn't we try to incentivize people to have hybrid vehicles and let them pay less in fuel tax? So there was a big difference there nationally. Support for hybrid drivers paying less in gas tax was from Democrats, urban, higher educated, and younger respondents. Particularly interesting to me, we had some people who had hybrid vehicles, and we asked them that on the survey. There was 80% support, not surprisingly, although I thought it would have been higher. We had 89 people that had hybrid vehicles. We had 15 people that drove electric vehicles, and they actually had a 98% support for their hybrid vehicle drivers paying less in fuel tax. And you see, this is one that some of the groups have a fairly large spread. Urban and rural, and then political party affiliation in particular have big spreads between their support for this topic. We asked another question that really expanded those options. So we gave them 8 options for revenue sources: gas tax, motor vehicle and driver license fees, highway use tax, alternative fuel fee, tolls, general sales tax, property tax, and vehicle mile driven user fee. Those are the 8 choices we gave them. And we told them, distribute amongst 100% between each of these options. Tell us what you think, how you think we should fund our system. So the blue lines here, the blue bars, represent what the current percent is. So the gas tax currently contributes 55%, motor vehicle and driver license fees 25%, highway use tax 20%. The bottom 3 are at 0%. And we actually broke our respondents into 2 categories. Half the people we told what those percents were, and half the people we didn't. So the green bar here represents those who were given this information. So the green bar those respondents knew that the gas tax represented 55%. The orange bar were people who weren't told that information. They didn't know how much each of these currently contributed. So we'll see that there are some differences there. The green line is always closer to that blue bar. So when we gave them the reference, they were always closer to what that point of reference was. The orange bar was always further away. A lot of times, though, they were very close. So even without that information, people had still strong feelings. One thing I will point out, the vehicle miles driven fee, everybody, even though they were told, half of them were told it's 0%, still around 22% of people still on average said around 22% should come from vehicle miles driven. Yes.
I have a question actually from Julie Eiselt, who's on the phone.
Okay.
How would you capture out-of-state drivers with the VMT, like for places that are right close to the state line?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of details that have to be worked out, and there need to be some larger system to protect that. But currently with the gas tax, I think that's happening. So that we have people that are in those border communities going across state lines and aren't paying. So that'd be something that had to be investigated. Maybe there's no net effect if you change from a vehicle miles driven to from the gas tax. But if you had a more national system or interstate system.
So it's difficult, but part of the pilots that are going on is, calculating a VMT cost monthly for a particular customer in a state, but then they credit back what you spent on motor fuel. So, in other words, if you're not in state, you wouldn't be participating because you can't. You're not a citizen, so you wouldn't be. But you then get the credit back for what you spent on motor fuel, so the only thing that you would be losing would be that difference with those drivers from out of state, because they'd still be somewhat purchasing motor fuels in North Carolina to compensate. So there's no real direct, easy answer unless you went to a national system, which we don't see that happening.
And so there were a lot of support for some of these options that don't currently make up a large portion. But summarizing, there is general support amongst North Carolinians for increasing transportation funding. There is still that preference for the gas tax, although there is support for a diversity of funding sources. Many of them do not know what the current gas tax rate is or believe it's lower than it actually is. They're split as to whether transportation should be funded from general or usage-based fees. And they believe in general that $400 a year is fair to pay to have access to 15,000 miles. And one of the things that was surprising to me, this last bullet here, looking at urban and rural, we found that really there's similar beliefs whether they were urban or rural for the most part. There are some statistically significant differences, but for the most part, they were similar between urban and rural areas. I'd be glad to take any questions if there are any further questions.
I have a quick, on this previous slide, given that the green bar people knew the answer to those questions and that they're to the left of the actual number, does that imply that the people with the greens actually still opposed those revenue sources and favored the ones more at the bottom? In others, it looks to me like that's the way you'd read that.
And some of this is partly by giving them extra choices. They maybe felt like they didn't want to put zeros down here. And so then maybe they said, we want there to be funding from all these sources. And so in order to add something here, they had to take away some from the gas tax. So it could be the way the question was worded and giving them all those options influenced that it kind of naturally reduced some of the gas tax.
So it had to all add to 100.
Correct.
Aside from the urban-rural similarities, what else surprised you?
I think this one, the more time we've spent talking about it, that people who both knew that 0%, we get 0% from vehicle miles driven, and those who didn't, about a fifth of people think that, on average, people think a fifth of our funding should come from vehicle miles driven. This one, based on the previous questions, it's somewhat in conflict when you just ask them generally, but when you give them specific and you give them this budget of 100%, where do you plug it in? A lot of people start supporting, well, yeah, vehicle miles, that makes sense. I should pay based on how much I drive. So this, in general, kind of surprised me as well.
Any other questions? Dr. Finley, thank you.
Thank
And your team very much. That's tremendous work.